This is the story of the little island off the coast of England, Britain's little companion. From its earliest geographical formation to the Second World War, this island has seen occupations and invasions, kings and queens, uprisings, bombings, war and peace, saints and sinners, devils and angels. This is a short history of the Isle of Wight, England's little friend.
So the actual island itself was formed at the end of the last ice age. As the ice began to melt, the river valley of the Solent was flooded, and what would become the English Channel was flooded, and that cut off this area of land from the rest of England, creating what we now know as the island of the Isle of Wight. Its first inhabitants came from a similar time period. As the ice began to recede, the climate got better, hunter-gatherers migrated over to the Isle of Wight. It wasn't long before nomadic traders and merchants began to use the island as a seaport to actually trade with the Middle East. This was during the Neolithic era, with wheat becoming its primary export. In the period between the Neolithic era and the Roman era, Britain became a hub of migration, and the Isle of Wight was no different. A number of Iron Age hoards have actually been found, suggesting that people were coming from all over the place to come and settle in the Isle of Wight. So where does the name Isle of Wight come from? Well, there are many theories as to where Isle of Wight came from, and loads of different languages from all its different inhabitants played a part in creating what we now call the Isle of Wight. One of the island's primary names was the Isle of Vectus, used by the Romans in their histories and reports of invasions and settling on the island. The Celtic language, the Welsh language, the Germanic language, and Latin all had very similar words used to describe this island, all of which meant different variations of small, daughter, friend, and so we can suggest that the name the Isle of Wight came to mean little companion or little friend, which I think is a perfect name for a little island off the coast of England. England's little companion. So when the Romans finally arrived, they settled here, but they didn't actually build any towns, just a number of villas. And with these villas came impressive vineyards. The soil was easy to plough, and the climate was much nicer and much warmer than it is today. So it was perfect conditions for the Romans to plant some of their iconic vineyards. By the late 4th or 5th centuries AD, the Romans had left Britain and the Isle of Wight. After the Romans left, the first invaders were the Jutes, with Cerdic and his son Cinric conquering the island in 530. Upon Cerdic's death, rule of the island was given to his nephews Stuf and Witgar. Stuf and his successors would establish a Jutish kingdom on the isle until Wulfhere of Mercia invaded, conquered, and converted the island to Christianity. But as soon as he left, the island reverted back to paganism. Arwald was the last king of the Jutes and the last pagan king in Anglo-Saxon England until the Vikings. And when the Vikings came, they came for the Isle of Wight too. The invaders were quick to raid the island, setting it up as their winter base to wage war on mainland England. They ravaged the south from the island, and when the English king Ethelred the Unready died, it was used as the launching pad to establish a Danish king in England. The throne of England was under turmoil for years, and by 1066 the Isle of Wight became a base for a number of the contenders for the crown. First Tostig, and then his brother Harold Godwinson. In 1066 Britain changed forever. The invading Normans defeated the Saxons at the Battle of Hastings and established William as Britain's new king. William gave management of the island over to his kinsman William Fitz-Osborne, who set up the Isle of Wight as an almost entirely independent feudal fiefdom. It stayed like this for over 200 years, where the inhabitants of the isle served the lord or lady of the island rather than the king. The last lady of the Isle of Wight was the Norman Countess Isabella de Fortibus, who, on her deathbed, was convinced to sell the island to King Edward I, and the isle was returned to the control of the English crown once more. Over the next few hundred years, the island was harassed by raids and invaders from France, with one invasion getting to Carisbrooke Castle, where they besieged it. But none of these were successful, and the island remained under English control. When Henry VIII established the permanent naval base in Portsmouth, he also set up fortifications across the Isle of Wight, sometimes using stones from dissolved monasteries as building materials. The Tudor period was a tumultuous one for the island, with another French invasion looking to use the Isle of Wight as a base against the mainland. They were defeated by the island's militia in 2 decisive battles, and as the Spanish Armada threatened Britain's shores, some of the most decisive action took place within sight of the Isle of Wight, and as the Spanish threat lingered, the island was refortified once again. Less than 50 years later, England had been torn apart by civil war, its king defeated, and Parliament were establishing their new government. Charles I, looking to avoid capture, fled, ending up on the Isle of Wight, not realising that its governor had already declared for Parliament. Charles was imprisoned at Carisbrooke Castle. He attempted to escape multiple times without success. He was eventually executed on the 30th of January 1649. All was well on the island until the 7 Years' War, where it was used as a base against the French, with a large force of soldiers stationed here. After this, the island became a hub of boat building and maritime industry. As the Victorian era deepened, the island became one of the favourite holiday destinations of the Queen, and she used Osborne House as her winter home. The Isle of Wight became a fashionable holiday resort for many Victorians, including Alfred Lord Tennyson, Julia Margaret Cameron, and Charles Dickens. This growth in tourism saw the island undergo significant urban development, going from an entirely rural island to one with impressive coastal resorts. This trend continued, and as the Second World War began, the island was frequently bombed due to its proximity to Nazi-occupied France and the presence of an RAF radar station at Ventnor. One of the most dramatic incidents on the Isle of Wight during the war came on the night of the 4th to the 5th of May 1942, in which a Polish destroyer single-handedly defended the towns of Cowes and East Cowes from a detachment of German bombers.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Present History podcast. Make sure to like and subscribe, leave a review if you're feeling positive, and we'll see you in the next one.